now, Washington Mornings on the Mall. 105.9 FM. And AM 630. WMAL.
8:37 on WMAL, where Washington comes to talk. Brian Wilson, Brian Neiman standing by on the phone. You know him, you love him, you can't live without him. Larry Kudlow from CNBC, also the host of the Larry Kudlow Show on WMAL, which can be heard Saturdays at 7 p.m. right here on the station where Washington comes to talk. Hello, Larry. How are you?
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you.
All right, let's start by talking. I don't think we had the pleasure of chatting with you since Wisconsin. I don't think we have. What do you think about what happened in Wisconsin?
Well, I thought it was a real game changer. You know, I think that the whole Scott Walker campaign to curb public sector union benefits and pensions and privileges at taxpayer expense got a real shot in the arm. It was a tremendous victory for Scott Walker, and interestingly, bolstered by, of all places, California, where public union pensions were curbed in places like San Diego and San Jose, not known as conservative strongholds. And I think it reflects a lot of what we've seen around the country, really in recent years, most notably, say, Chris Christie in New Jersey, Mitch Daniels in Indiana, John Kasich in Ohio. So I think you have a real trend there, and I think Scott Walker's victory punctuated that trend. And regrettably, I don't think President Obama gets it at all, doesn't understand what happened to him.
You know, we've seen it in the states, in the local, municipalities where you have spending that's been reined in, cutting pensions and things like that. We saw what Scott Walker did, and as you mentioned, New Jersey. We haven't obviously seen it at the federal level. Can we see it at the federal level? I mean, do we have to wait for after the election before any of that actually occurs?
Yeah, well, my reckoning is you will have to wait till after the election. You know, some federal pay freezes, first of all, have been proposed by the president, not very substantial ones, as I recall. But he had it in one of his budgets. I don't remember how long it lasted. I thought it was 2 or 3 years. It wasn't a deep freeze. But I think federal workers, just like their state and local counterparts, have a tremendous advantage, if not in wages, certainly in benefits and pensions over their private sector counterparts. I think that's the key. And I think you see a political split, by the way, between private unions who have to pay the higher property taxes or the higher income taxes to finance their public sector brethren. And they don't like that, these private union guys. So there's a big split in the union movement.
What about the president's comments that, it's the
private sector's doing fine?
Yeah, the private sector's doing fine, and it's the public sector that needs all the help.
Well, again, I think, there's two things going on here. I don't really think there was a particular gaffe. I think the president believes that.
I do, too.
And I think that his model of economic growth is to sustain and enlarge the government sector. I think that's an important part of his philosophy, which is a more European-style social welfare philosophy. Regarding the private sector, it's a great number this morning on the front page of Investors Business Daily. They're talking about a poll which bodes poorly for Obama, but what they say is if you look at the number of households with at least one person looking for employment, it's 23%. That translates into 30 million people looking for work. It is something the mainstream media often miss. 30 million people looking for work.
Wow.
Now, that's not too far from the 23 million number of vanishing workforce where people are either underemployed or quit looking for work altogether. And these are things that I don't think the president appreciates because he's, fundamentally he would say businesses are profitable or some businesses are profitable and that's good enough and that's all we need and they should stop bellyaching. What we have to do is recoup the local state government jobs. We don't need to recoup the local state government jobs. We need to thin down where possible. A lot of the redundancies exist. It's a particular theme of Mitt Romney, these redundancies, overlaps and replications. But I think it really shows the president's philosophical bias. This is how economy should work, with the government sector in the lead.
All right, we'll turn to Europe now, where, obviously we've been talking about Greece for quite some time and always worried about Italy and France and Ireland, and now Spain goes down as well. Where are we in Europe, and is it just a matter of time before this thing just completely blows up over there?
Well, it's risky. It's funny, the Spanish bank bailout at first went over well, but there's some issues here about, I don't want to get into details, but who gets the first lien on the bonds? I mean, does the government now, the EU government or the ESM get the first lien? That's one of the bailout agencies ahead of private creditors, and that's one of the reasons why this Spanish thing kind of fell apart yesterday. People are very unclear what the credit lineup is going to be, who's ahead of whom. The big one, I got to say, is the Greek vote on Sunday. Very important, because if the vote goes far left, and the far left party certainly is one of the leading two parties, then there's no telling how difficult, maybe even catastrophic, this might be, at least in the short run. I mean, Greece is a small economy, but nonetheless, it can pose a lot of problems in the banking world, in the contagion world. I'm quite worried about this. I think that in the long term, no, it's not that important. In the short run, the Greek vote could be extremely important if they choose to leave the Eurozone. Now, some polls in Greece, if any of this stuff is reliable, show that they wish to remain in the Eurozone. But I don't know how that's going to translate. So you could have a short-term catastrophe. I don't want to sugarcoat that at all.
And that means for the markets?
Yeah, it's a market phenomenon. It's not an economic phenomenon. I mean, I did some numbers last night on our show. Our trade exposure to Greece is about 13% of our exports. That's about 1.5% of GDP. It's not that big. If you had a total European zone catastrophe, the whole thing goes into a deep double-dip recession. It would cause us to lose about 1.5% of GDP. Now, that's not to be, I'm sorry, it would cause us to lose 0.5% of GDP, 0.5%. That's not nothing in an economy growing at 1.9, but it's not a catastrophe. A much bigger problem is the fiscal cliff, which the CBO has estimated to lose 3.5% of GDP. Do you see what I'm saying?
Right.
The cliff, it could lose 3.5% of GDP if it goes through, whereas a euro catastrophe would cause us to lose 0.5% of GDP. So the stakes are much higher on the fiscal cliff. But in terms of the markets, as you asked, yes, I think if Greece somehow votes far left and it looks like they're going to leave the Eurozone, I mean, they don't have drachma. They haven't even printed the currency. I don't know how they expect to function. The banking system would collapse even more than it is, and it could spill over into Italy. So, yeah, that's a big issue. Sunday's vote, big issue.
All right, Larry, always good to have you. Thank you so much.